So, welcome back to our Wednesday study as we have been going verse by verse through the book of Ruth. We're going to finish it up today with Ruth chapter 4. We have seen Ruth and her family, her husband Elimelech, their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, go from Bethlehem during a time of famine across the Jordan River into Moab, the enemy. They went into Moab to try to find some relief from the famine. And while they were there, Elimelech died. Mahlon and Chilion found some Moabite wives, got married, and then both of them died. Naomi then was able to convince Orpah, one of her widowed daughters-in-law, to remain behind in Moab, find a new husband, while Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, went with Naomi back to Bethlehem as the famine had passed. And they come into Bethlehem, and Naomi is full of grief and full of bitterness, and she's upset. She feels as though God is against her in what she's trying to do. Ruth, though, has become a believer at this point, and she has tied herself to Naomi. Naomi says that she has left full with her family, but is coming home empty, even though Ruth is coming home with her. And then in Ruth chapter 2, having apparently studied Scripture, Ruth heads out to try to gather some food for she and Naomi as they're both destitute. And she comes across, the Lord leads her to the field of a man named Boaz, who is called in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, a worthy man, which means he's a faithful man, he's valiant, he has great integrity, and he protects Ruth and takes care of Ruth and provides for Ruth. And then in Ruth chapter 3, Naomi sends Ruth out with a plan, a strategy. And Ruth goes out to where Boaz is working on his crops, separating the good parts of the grain from the parts that they don't need out on the threshing floor. And Ruth reminds Boaz, at the instruction of Naomi, Ruth reminds Boaz of the responsibility of the kinsman redeemer to both help she and Naomi by purchasing land that had previously belonged to Elimelech, as well as taking on the Levirate responsibilities of marrying Ruth. And Boaz informs Ruth that there is another relative in town who is a closer relative than he is, who has first right to the kinsman redeemer. And so Boaz is going to go offer it to him first. But he warns Ruth, he says that possibly this man could become the one who is the kinsman redeemer, all while Boaz knows he has a plan in mind. And so he loads Ruth up with some grain, sends her back home. The grain is for Naomi almost as a pledge, a promise of what he's going to do. And then we get into Ruth chapter 4, and we begin to see the realization of Boaz's plan. So Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. So Boaz went to the place where he knew the other closer Redeemer was sure to pass, either on his way out to the fields or on his way out to the water source, the well that actually David references later. The well at Bethlehem is not too far away, just outside of town. And so this is told here in this verse as though Boaz went to the town gate first thing in the morning so as to make sure that he would see the man, this other closer Redeemer, as soon as possible. Notice also that the other Redeemer is never mentioned by name throughout this entire passage. He was unwilling to be a part of the process for his own means, for his own benefit, for his own protection. So he is unnamed here. Verse 2. And he, that's Boaz, took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. This word elder is very interesting. The word itself comes from a word meaning beard in the Hebrew. It comes with the implication of age. However, over time, the word came to mean a leader or administrator, whether or not the specific person was generally older in age. And the Old Testament itself speaks of elders in several senses. You have tribal elders like Deuteronomy chapter 31. You had clan elders from Judges chapter 11. You have city elders like here from Deuteronomy chapter 19. And there doesn't seem to be any specific universal rules regarding the type or the amount of elders in each role. We're told in Judges chapter 8, there was a town called Succoth had 77 elders. Here in Ruth chapter 4, Bethlehem had at least 10. It says that Boaz pulled aside 10 of the elders. So it's implied that there were more than just 10. Possibly the number corresponded to the size of a city or the need of a city, but there's no specific indication as to why a certain number of elders was used rather than a different amount of elders. And, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, this instance of Boaz pulling the elders is very strategic, because in Deuteronomy chapter 25, we see that the authority of the elders was necessary to witness the rejection of a Levirate marriage. It doesn't tell us that the presence of the elders was needed when the Levirate marriage was accepted, but only in the case of a rejected one. And so in the case here in Ruth 4, Boaz needed the elders to be present if the other redeemer were to reject his legal kinsman rights and responsibilities. So, I love Boaz. He's planning ahead for the outcome that he anticipated and the outcome toward which he was working. He was thinking in advance that I'm going to work on this to get this guy. He's going to reject it, and I need these elders to witness this process. And so he gets them there to see it. Verse 3. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi has come back from the country of Moab, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling a parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So Boaz begins to introduce his very well thought out plan and strategy. He says, Naomi's selling a piece of land that had formerly belonged to her husband, possibly because of her great financial need. She's selling it. And buying land in this way was the primary reason, the main purpose for a kinsman redeemer. He was supposed to purchase the land to help a struggling family member so they could have some financial means in order to buy food and things that they would need. And so Boaz presents that. Here's Naomi selling land. You need to buy it. You're the kinsman redeemer to help them out. Verse 4, he says, So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So notice here how Boaz sets up the entire scene, right? The closer redeemer is there along with the 10 of the town elders to serve as witnesses to the whole interaction here. And he wanted to make absolutely sure that nothing was missed and everything was official, everything was above board, nothing could be revoked. And he starts the proceeding in the easiest way possible by presenting the redemption opportunity as a mere case of real estate. He also assures everyone that if this closer redeemer will not fulfill his duty, that he, Boaz, who is the next redeemer in line for Elimelech, he's more than ready to purchase the land right then and there. And so the closer redeemer is willing. He's willing to expand his current land holdings with the purchase of Elimelech's property. But Boaz intentionally holds back his primary point of interest for this moment, most likely knowing how this other man will respond. I mean, it's a small town. He knows everybody in town. He most likely knows what this man's going to do with the information that he's about to present. So Boaz says, Naomi's selling land. You're up first to buy it. The guy says, okay, I will buy it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So it would seem that Ruth's first husband, Naomi's son, he may have been Elimelech's firstborn, as Ruth's marriage was included in the redemption of the land. Or possibly the other son was the firstborn, and his wife turning away from Naomi, returning to her own people for a new husband, that would have surrendered her right to the land, in which case it would have reverted to the Ruth's husband, who also died, and then it would have been tied to Ruth as the wife of the now deceased secondborn. And so whether Ruth's husband was the firstborn or secondborn is beside the point at the moment. She's tied herself to Naomi. She's tied herself to their inheritance, to their family. And so at this point, marriage to Ruth is included in the redemption of the land for whichever kinsman was willing to fulfill his responsibilities. And so while the closer redeemer was willing to redeem the land, now that Boaz has, informed not just him, but the elders that actually Ruth is in on this as well. If you actually want to redeem the land, you also have to redeem her and have a son in the name of her dead husband. Verse 6, then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Notice in that verse, he says it twice. I cannot redeem it. He doesn't say, I'm not willing to redeem it, whereas before he said, I'm willing to redeem the land. Here, when it comes to Ruth, he says, I cannot, unable. When the redemption simply involved the land and the belongings, the other Redeemer was ready and willing. But once he realized that he would also be responsible for Ruth and other children that she may have, he wanted nothing to do with the situation. Possibly not only would this other potential child inherit, the Elimelech's family inheritance, but also being the child of this closer Redeemer may also inherit a chunk of his property. And so it would threaten that. But, he doesn't necessarily explain how his own inheritance might be impaired or destroyed or ruined. And it seems a very odd way of thinking, unless there's some sort of ancient custom concerning kinsman redemption and levirate marriages that we're not yet aware about. But he could be meaning that by taking on Ruth, he's also taking on Naomi and other potential offspring that Ruth might bear. This other Redeemer would then be incurring significantly more expenses than he was planning for simply taking on the land. And significantly more expenses would significantly reduce the size of whatever inheritance he might have to leave to his own legal offspring. And seeing as this Redeemer was hesitant to risk the reduction of his own fortune for the sake of Ruth and Naomi, especially when there was another willing Redeemer waiting in line, he just said, okay, I don't want it. I cannot redeem it. You do it. You take it. I cannot. I don't want any part of it. And then this guy isn't talked about anymore. Verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, he drew off his sandal. Now this is it sounds to us very odd custom, but it's very interesting because it directly comes from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 9. Because in Deuteronomy 25:9, there are the regulations for levirate marriages. So when the Redeemer in Deuteronomy was unwilling to give his dead brother or family member an heir, then the widow would yank off his sandal in front of the elders and then would spit in his face. And the unwilling Redeemer's household would bear the title, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. And it was a great insult. It carried with it significantly negative connotations, implying a faithlessness in the character of such a person. But if you look here at this scene in Ruth 4, it doesn't really seem to bear so much negative weight as the passage in Deuteronomy 25 tells us should be there. You notice in this verse, it says that the reluctant Redeemer removes his own sandal. It's not forcibly removed by the dishonored widow. There's no spit in the man's face. He just removes his own sandal. And so possibly the sandal removal has become a symbol of the closer kinsman relinquishing his Redeemer rights to the next closest Redeemer, more than it was originally meant to inform of this man's faithlessness and be an insult. Now seems to have just be a symbol of him relinquishing his Redeemer rights. Verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Now, this is the first and only statement in the entire book of Ruth to which brother Ruth had been married. This is the first time we see she was married to Mahlon. Other times it just, it says Mahlon and Chilion died. Ruth and Orpah were their widows. It doesn't say who went with who, but here it does. Notice also here that Boaz knows full well that even though he has purchased the belongings and land and was going to marry Ruth, all of that would be in the name of his dead relative. So legally and officially, all would be in the name of Mahlon, but Boaz is the one remembered, while these brothers, both of them, Mahlon and Chilion, Ruth, Mahlon, her husband, even though legally all this stuff would be in his name, Mahlon is mostly forgotten, but Boaz is not. Boaz is really, he's an illustration of what Jesus has done for us. He redeemed us when we were in dire straits and no one else would help us. Verse 11, "Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" So first, at the gate, people had been gathering, so that probably they were passing by, coming in and out of the city, and they noticed the scene that's playing out, and they stopped to watch. And they all give the three prayerful blessings here. They pray for fruitfulness, in the sense that of many children, in the same way that Jacob's children formed the entire nation of Israel. They also pray for worthiness and renowned. But this word for worthiness here, it's different from the word's previous use in English that describe both Boaz and Ruth. The word here is more in line with might and power, which fits with the prayer for renown, meaning respect and recognition. And then you've got this third prayer. It's another prayer for recognition and esteem to come from whatever and however many children were born, to be born to Boaz and Ruth. And they use the example of Perez, who was the son of Judah and Tamar. And Judah and Tamar are not really the most ideal examples of faithfulness. However, it's through their son Perez that the tribe of Judah was descended, and that they had come to settle in Bethlehem from 1 Chronicles chapter 2. One of the descendants was a guy named Bethlehem. He created the city and it's named Bethlehem. And ultimately, King David and Jesus would both come from this ancestral line, thus seeing the fulfillment of this prayer. Verse 13. "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son." So the Lord gave her conception. It would seem that Ruth had not been able to have children during her first marriage. Now that she was married to Boaz, the Lord made it possible for her to become pregnant. And her descendants through Boaz would be instrumental in the history of Israel and in the history of the world. Ruth's redemption brought about our redemption through her descendant, Jesus. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." So Ruth is recognized by the women of Bethlehem as having been a blessing to Naomi beyond what any number of sons would have been, especially in ancient society where sons were prized above all else. And it mentions there, she's more valuable to you than 7 sons, the 7 being the ultimate number, the perfect number, than having the perfect amount of sons. They said Ruth has been more valuable to you than what our culture says is the most valuable thing. Ruth was extremely loyal extremely faithful. And she had honored Naomi to the most incredible degree through her faithfulness to the Lord and her newfound faith itself. Naomi has seen, she is seen by the women of the city as having been redeemed just as much as Ruth had been. So the two of them are forever linked together because Ruth would not abandon Naomi to being alone, which in that day and time for a widow of her age, it would have possibly been a death sentence. So in this explanation to the Redeemer Boaz, he had not fully explained everything to the closer Redeemer. The redemption would include the land and marriage to Ruth, but it would also include the care of Naomi in the process. Verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And Obed, that name could be derived from the word for servant, but it also means worshiper. So Naomi, she had been bitter and empty, and now she's full, she's faithful, she's consumed with service and worship here. And now look at, this is very interesting. This is a very interesting genealogical list, okay? It says, now these were the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. What makes this so interesting is we see right off the bat, you got Perez, and we know his father was Judah, the tribe of Judah. That Perez had gotten married and he had a son named Hezron, and both Perez and Hezron were among the group of Jacob's family that moved to Egypt to be with Joseph. This is from Genesis chapter 46, verse 12. So you got Perez and Hezron moving into Egypt to be with Joseph. And Ram, mentioned there, he is the direct son of Hezron, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 9. However, Aminadab, who is said here to be the son of Hezron, or to be the son of Ram, Aminadab was the father-in-law of Aaron, Moses' brother, who lived several hundred years after Hezron and Ram. So what is going on here then? I mean, it can't be suggesting that Hezron and Ram lived hundreds of years. Rather, what would seem to have happened in this list, several generations are apparently skipped from Ram to Aminadab. Ram is still considered the father of Aminadab. They're just several generations removed. The list condenses the list of of ancestors, as the book itself is so brief. I mean, if they had listed out all of the generations from Ram down to Aminadab, it may have taken just as much of the chapter as the emphasis of the redemption, when the redemption was the main point, not the genealogy. And so it condenses it down. So Ram was the father of Aminadab, just the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, however many greats it is. So the emphasis is on the redemption and a reminder that God continues his promise of maintaining the genealogical line of the Messiah throughout even so turbulent a time as that of the judges. And so that gives us hope. I mean, there's still hope, even in the darkest of days. There's always hope through the darkest of days because of the promise of eternity obtained through faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we see that in the book of Ruth, in such a time when everybody did whatever they saw fit. There was there was just rampant lawlessness in the time of the judges, and evil and wickedness and corruption and love of evil, that God was still at work, that there were still faithful people during that time. And so we see God moving and working, and their son, Ruth and Boaz's son, Obed, was the grandfather of the great King David, that God orchestrated this whole deal and brought about this whole thing to bring them to this point. Boaz willing to marry a Moabite, possibly because his own mother was not an Israelite, Rahab, she was a Canaanite. And maybe that's also the reason Boaz was single when he was the age he was, possibly a generation or so more older than Ruth. that no one would have him because of his lineage, because he was a half Canaanite. But God was using that for this moment so he could marry Ruth, the Moabite, and they could have a son named Obed, who ends up being the grandfather of great King David, who changes the direction of the nation of Israel and becomes a descendant himself, or an ancestor himself, of the Messiah, Jesus. And so no matter what we got going on in our lives, we may not see God's full plan. We just need to remain faithful in the middle of whatever is going on and trust that God knows what he's doing. And so whatever you're going through, trust that God knows what he's doing and he will take care of you in the middle of even the craziest, darkest of times. So I want to thank you for joining us as we've been looking through the book of Ruth. Next time, we're going to begin to take a look at 1 Samuel and what goes on there, as Samuel himself is the very last of the judges, and what God is going to do as the nation of Israel sees a transition in their time. So thank you for joining us, and I will catch you in that next one.